mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. What I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. What's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like Live. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. Welcome also back, of course, to Black Power Media and all the good things continuing to happen here. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you might be. And when you might see this, peace, greetings, all those good things. What's up, Roz Elbow, Jadorian, Lisa, Derek, Craig, Sugar Booger. Good morning, everybody. Pookie Wood, what's up? Good morning. Good morning. Welcome, welcome. And to all those watching, not commenting, welcome to you as well. Please do hit that like button. Hit the share button, invite your friends, your foes, your comrades, your colleagues, and invite them to join this good discussion. We're going to be breaking it up into some parts today. Well, I was going to say unfortunately, but it may work out more conveniently for you. Of course, I'm endeavoring to keep it at the 8 a.m. block Eastern time to maintain, to hold it down until the Remix morning show reconvenes again on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And then I'll be back again Friday morning to start off Dope Fridays. But today, after this, going to take a quick break and come back at 12 noon for another discussion with Bob Brown of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, Guinea-Conakry. Of course, has a long history in the Black freedom struggle, and as a comrade of Kwame Ture, someone heavily involved with a number of different formations and histories that are important to us here at this channel, and of course, to some extent, increasingly becoming important, more broadly speaking. Shout out to the hater who hit the dislike button right off the top. We appreciate you, and we'll see if we can earn that back. Anyway, to the rest of you, appreciate you hitting the like button, the share button. Michael Craig, Ethan Bakuli, welcome. Ya Oforiwa. Ya Oforiwa. I hope I got that right. Good morning, Nolan. Good morning to you as well. Jesse Jenkins, Ella's Child, KD. Appreciate you coming through. We are going to be joined this morning by Professor August Nimtz Jr., who is Professor of Political Science and African American and African Studies at the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota. He specializes in Marxism, political economy, politics of race and ethnicity, and African politics. His link and to learn more about him and his work is in the show notes for this show. And we're going to be joined by him in a few minutes to discuss an article he sent me, written some years ago, closer to the time Robinson's work came out, titled Review, Marxism and the Black Struggle, the Class versus Race Debate Revisited. This came out in, 1985 in the Journal of African Marxists. It's a very interesting read. So as Cedric Robinson continues to justifiably sort of gain some renewed or new attention with his classic work, Black Marxism, which is there behind me. and more discussion of his work as it is extended by those talking about racial capitalism. I think that this criticism is really important. Can you get a link to the article? I don't think so. I'll double check, or I'll ask if we can. I mean, I'm sure by now it should be cool. Maybe we can just post at I don't know. Well, I'll have to look into that. And when he shows up, we'll ask him about it. But yeah, I mean, but we'll certainly go through it as much as we can this morning. What I will do here, and it looks like, oh, this is perfect. He's here just now. So I've just introduced him and introduced the topic. Again, I just want to just say very quickly before we get started that unfortunately we have to have sort of an abrupt, hard end right at 9 a.m. Eastern. So I can jump to this meeting, and then I'll come back. And then I think did he get it set up? Because Kalanji is supposed to be, I think he's dropping at 10 a.m. this morning, his classic interview with Max Stanford. Yep. 10 a.m. this morning. So shortly after we wrap this up, Riot Starter will premiere at right here at Black Power Media, a classic discussion with Max Stanford discussing the Revolutionary Action Movement and more. And then we'll be back at 12 with Bob Brown. So we're having a sort of a whole bunch going on already today. So stick around. So that said, let me welcome Professor Nimtz to the show. Good morning, good sir. It's good to see you and to meet you. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to be on.
Well, I first of all, I appreciate, again, I like to share when these things happen that one thing that I like about what we do here, and certainly that I try to do, is that we try to remain open. So folks that we may not have come across, we invite, folks to reach out. You reached out after seeing some previous programming and sent me some of your work and said this might be worthy of discussion. I have read at least this much of your work and fully agree that it is. So I really appreciate that you did that, and I'm happy to have you join us. So again, I think that's great. But having introduced you a little bit and introduced the work that you sent me, at least, I did want to just give you a chance before we get into some of the details to just offer up, if you would, your overall criticism of Robinson's work, or how you might think it maybe is being interpreted or misinterpreted today.
Well, again, thanks for having me on, Jared. It's important to understand the context. When Robinson wrote his book and my critique of the book in 1985, for about 10 years, as I say in my review, there was an ongoing debate, actually for more than a decade. In fact, I was just going through archives around my work in the African Liberation Support Committee, which I've just sent to the archives at Michigan State. So a lot of things began to come back to me. So from about 68 to 69, there was an intense debate within the Black struggle and activists about the relative weight of race versus class. And within that framework, the issue was whether or not was a Marxist perspective relevant at all to making sense of the black struggle. So that's the context in which I wrote my critique of Robinson. And I concluded that Robinson was very much, despite the title of his book, Black Marxism, was really a cultural nationalist defense of the black struggle. And it was from that perspective, from the perspective of someone who had become convinced by the need for a class Marxist perspective, as I had been converted to, especially after living in Tanzania for almost 2 years between 1968 and 1970. I was convinced of the need for a class Marxist perspective. So that's the background to my critique of Robinson. And then when the book came out in 1985, that was in the context of the developments in the Caribbean, especially the Grenada Revolution beginning in 1979. And it seemed to me by that time Robinson should have been convinced of the need for a class Marxist perspective because it was in practice. It was actually going on. That's what was going on at that moment in the Caribbean, especially the Grenada Revolution. And then coupled with the Cuban Revolution, I had spent, again, 2 years in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, the unofficial headquarters of the Southern African Liberation Movement, getting to know people like Walter Rodney, who was a neighbor of mine, and mixing it up with revolutionaries from the Southern African Liberation Movement, Frelimo, the African National Congress, the Pan-African Congress, and so on. And so I was convinced by then that Robinson should certainly have been aware of those developments. And it was no longer a sterile academic debate, but facts on the ground seemed to me to require that we rethink simply looking at the Black struggle from a cultural nationalist perspective.
Right on. I appreciate that. So I don't want. I'm scared to take this detour, but I can't let that comment go by. I mean, you can't just drop that you were a neighbor to Walter Rodney, and we just move on. So I have to ask. I mean, can you? I got to ask something. I don't know. Can you elaborate on what that experience was like? I mean, I don't even know what to say. I wasn't ready for that one, to be honest with you.
Okay.
But having said that, I mean, like I said, we can't let that go by. What
Sure.
was that like? And
Sure.
Yeah. What can you share? Yeah.
Yeah. Walter and I happened to be born in the same year, 1942. I come out of the Black reality in New Orleans, and he and I went to graduate school in different places, but at the same time. And I went to Tanzania to do dissertation research, and he was on the faculty at University of Dar es Salaam. And that's where I got to know him, because I had to be affiliated with the University of Dar es Salaam. And he and his wife, Pat, who is still employed, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in Atlanta, at Atlanta University Complex. I got to know them, and it was a very, very rewarding, and it was an eye-opener for me to meet people like them and to be a part of that process. So yeah, that's the brief story.
Yeah, we have to. We have to. I don't know. We have to come back and talk more about that. I mean, or somehow work it into this discussion on some level. I mean, I'm very interested to hear, how he was as a teacher or as a.
I didn't actually take courses from him, because I was a graduate student doing research. And so I would come to campus from time to time and to attend presentations and discussions and debates that were taking place that he was involved in. So yeah, basically he and I were cohorts of the same age. Yeah.
Right on. Anyway, that's fascinating. That's a nice little additional tidbit. I appreciate that. Anyway, we're coming back to the matter at hand. And by all means, feel free to reintroduce that detour at any point for this discussion if it works out that way. But one thing I did want to know, you wrote in this piece that in fact you wrote, going back to your criticism of where you think Robinson was coming from. You say that Black Marxism may be the most informed and sophisticated defense of the nationalist position, despite, as you say, the title, which may initially have misled someone before they picked up and read it, what he was saying. But you talk a little bit in the book, in your article here, about some of detailing some of what you think Robinson was off on, and in particular his which obviously dealt a lot with his misreading, as you would put it, or describe it, of Marx and Engels. I have just this broad question of you talk about his struggles with class. Could you just start us there, and then maybe I'll invite you to reflect on some of what you actually wrote here. But I mean, for instance, you say Robinson correctly notes that this observation could apply equally to the ideas of Marx and Engels. This their work itself is quoting. You quote him saying their work itself, the critique of bourgeois society and industrial capitalism, would someday, when the material forces of society had progressed beyond their stage of development in the 19th century, be subject to criticism, negation. What Robinson is saying here, a major assumption of his argument, is that 19th century European capitalism has undergone changes of such a degree that its fundamental features are qualitatively different from what Marx and Engels analyze, and you disagree with that. So you say that, again, you started here even talking about context, and you say that Robinson maybe misunderstood the context in which Marx and Engels are writing, and how their work could be applied to the context of the day even. So please elaborate on that if you would.
Yeah, for my generation, what was important was whether or not a theoretical perspective had applicability. Did it make sense? Did it help to advance the struggle? That people like you and I, who look like you and I, did it help to advance their struggle, regardless of where the theory came from? The question is whether or not did the theory help advance our struggle? And that's what, to me, was missing, I think, in Robinson's perspective. The question of whether or not a Marxist perspective was relevant or not to the 20th century is an empirical question. That's to be tested. In other words, you can't make that claim that it's not relevant ahead of time. You have to look at whether or not does it actually work. And it seemed to me that people I was affiliated with and worked with and so on in the liberation movement within Africa especially had decided it was relevant. It was relevant in the Caribbean, in places like Grenada, in Cuba and so on. So it's not an abstract theoretical question. The question is whether or not does it actually work? Does it have relevance to what people like you and I and fellow toilers are trying to? That's the proof in the pudding, whether or not it actually works. So that was my frustration with him, especially by 1985, looking at developments in the Caribbean, the role of the Cuban Revolution in advancing the struggle in Southern Africa. Mm-hmm. What was going on in Grenada at that particular moment? Someone like Maurice Bishop, who headed the revolution in Grenada and so on. As you see in my piece, I quoted Bishop right at the end of my piece. Mm-hmm. By the way, I didn't know, talking about a tidbit, I was going through my archives and I was reading through the contact list of the African Liberation Support Committee in 1973. And there's a list of 78 people who are contacts of the African Liberation Committee. Myself and some other person were the contacts in Minnesota. All right, so I get to the end of the list and I see there are contacts in the Caribbean. And lo and behold, the contact in Grenada in 1973 was Maurice Bishop. If I read that, I had no idea who Maurice Bishop was in 1973. All I'm trying to say is that the test for arguments and theoretical perspectives, whether or not do they help us make sense in advancing the struggles that our people face. And certainly Maurice Bishop had concluded by 1979, 1980, that indeed, and his advice in that last quote, his advice was to African Americans, have no fear of working with people of different skin colors.
Yeah, in fact, you say here, the full quote, if I can, it says, you quote him as saying, speaking in July of 1980, quote, "Let me add just one final thing. That is to say that we, without intending to be disrespectful, would very strongly recommend to the Black movement in America the importance of developing the firmest and closest links with the white working class movement and the white progressive movement. Our feeling certainly is that in order to win that struggle inside of America, it's extremely important that all progressive forces get together and wage a consistent fight against the real enemy."
And another
end quote. Sure.
And another part of my frustration was 20 years earlier, Malcolm X. Can I say that again? Malcolm X had concluded something similar. In the last 11 months of his life, he spoke at 3 meetings of the Socialist Workers' Party, a predominantly white Marxist organization in New York. That was in 1964 and 1965. In other words, what Bishop is saying is not something that came out of the blue. This is what the most advanced of us, Malcolm, this is what Malcolm was saying, had concluded. He had been to Africa. He had seen the Algerians. He had seen people of different skin colors who were revolutionaries. It forced him to rethink his ideas about just skin color. If you're functioning at the level of skin color, you're looking for revolutionaries. You want revolutionary. That's what Malcolm had concluded. So I'm claiming that Bishop is simply standing on the shoulders of someone like Malcolm X.
So part of the way you address this question in your article in critiquing Robinson is to talk about the ways in which shout out to CBS and anyway, the scholarlies that we all keep falling into it. But anyway, you talk about the ways in which Robinson misread Marx and Engels on the national and colonial question, and even on the racial question. Could you talk a little bit about that and how you think that might preclude today someone from understanding the need, as you just described there, for Black radicals to be willing to work with revolutionaries of other skin colors?
Right. He has three figures for making his case about a Black radical tradition. The novelist whose new novel, I understand, has just been published. Well, it's not as new. It's a complete novel.
His formerly unpublished Richard Wright's.
Richard Wright's, exactly.
And what is the underground? Something from the underground?
Right. It's an interesting story. Yeah, I just read the review. I haven't. Yeah. Okay. It's an important.
And I'm wondering. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. Evidently, it's about it's a fictional story, but it's about a crime that took place. A Black person in New York, Brooklyn, I think, who gets falsely accused of killing a white person. And so the brother has to go underground into the subway system, whatever, to try to survive. And it is framed by actually some real legal issues around about that time about the police and Blacks and so on. This is just a review I'd read. Evidently, Wright had published a short story about his narrative, but his publisher didn't want to publish it, and so now it's been published. And so so one of the three people, let's see, he is Richard Wright, W.E.B. Du Bois. And I'm trying to think of the third person.
Fanon.
Yeah, Fanon. And my argument is that both Fanon and certainly W.E.B. Du Bois considered themselves to be Marxists and communists.
Oh, certainly, no, C.L.R. James was the other one, I thought. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I critiqued him for not bringing James into the picture. James certainly never abandoned Marxism until the end of his life. James saw himself as a Marxist. And his discussions with Trotsky around the national question, and when Trotsky defends the Black nationalism and Black separatism, and Trotsky sets him straight on that question, because James is very leery of the brother, who I'm talking about from Jamaica, who the separatist brother in the 1920s who got framed.
Garvey,
of course, yeah. Trotsky is defending Garvey in his debates and discussions with James. And James, as far as I know, he never abandoned his Marxist perspective. So it seems to me the only person who did was Wright. And for reasons I think had a lot to do with the very corrupt, politically corrupt character of the Communist Party USA, and all of the horrors that were done in the name of Marxism by the Communist Party USA, which explains, I think, why right actually broke. But whereas in the case of, as you know, with Du Bois joined at the end of his life. I'll never forget it. Another tidbit: I was in Ghana in 1970-71, coming back from Tanzania, and there was Du Bois's grave at Christiansburg Castle, and my wife then and I are trying to get a picture taken of Du Bois's grave, and one of the police, army people comes along and tries to prevent us from taking that photograph. But I'll never forget in 1963, the famous March on Washington, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP had to admit at the March on Washington that Du Bois, his significance and so on, and that Du Bois that was a member of the Communist Party at the end of his life. Wilkins, of course, could never bring himself to admit that, but everybody knew what he was talking about.
Yeah, one of the themes, I want to at least come to some of this, because one of the themes that I took from your article here that I have as a running concern of my own is not that Marx and Engels are above criticism. It's not that Marx and Engels got everything permanently correct for all settings and all times and all communities. Sure. But it's that, for me, it's that a lot of the critics of Marx and Engels are critics based on strictly on their being Europeans or white and not on actually dealing with the work. So one of the things that intrigued me about your article here is the ways in which you make specific reference to what Robinson says of Marx and Engels, while also returning to Marx and Engels' actual texts on the subject matter. So for instance, you say in one section here, you say that in arguing that historical materialism has limited relevance in the semi-colonial and colonial world, Robinson correctly points out that Marx and Engels intended that their analysis and the rise of capitalism apply only to Western Europe. He errs in interpreting the caveat to mean that their methodology has no applicability to the so-called third world. Marx thought that his most important discoveries were, quote, one, that the existence of classes is merely linked to the particular historical phases in the development of production. Two, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. And three, that the dictatorship of the proletariat only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. And then you go on to note, with just one of your examples, that, as you've already mentioned here, that Walter Rodney already recognized at least some of this and was employing and used him as an example of the intellectuals who have consciously and successfully employed this framework in analyzing their own societies. So there's more that you do more of this throughout the piece, but I wanted to give you a chance, at least initially, to respond and elaborate on the point that I'm inviting here, that there isn't enough, or as I'm interpreting it, there isn't enough direct engagement with what Marx and Engels actually said in offering a critique to show what they did or did not get correct, at least in Robinson's work, and then I would argue in some of the criticisms of others. But could you go? Yeah,
no. It's an important question, and a lot of the work I've been doing actually since that article has been to flush that out, to provide details. In the early 1990s, in fact, I wrote a short article called the so-called Eurocentric Marx and Engels. Robinson was very much on my mind when I wrote that piece. It was to show in great detail how Marx and Engels began their project thinking about the world, the globe. That was their perspective in thinking about the revolutionary process. And whenever there were any uprisings, rebellions, in the so-called third world that we would later call the third world, Marx and Engels embraced them. They embraced these struggles. They were part of the global struggle against capitalism. And so the evidence I tried to show in later writings disputes the claim that their perspective was irrelevant to places in the world outside of Western Europe. And I argue the Russian question, you always got to remember about remember about Russia. We think sometimes Russia is European, but the majority of Russia is not in Europe. The majority of Russia is outside of Europe. And at the end of his life, Marx was studying Russian, trying to figure out the peasant question, because he realized how important it was. But there's also something else within Marx and Engels' framework that is oftentimes underappreciated: the Irish question, because Ireland was a underdeveloped subject of British imperialism. And for Marx and Engels, that was extremely important, because up until 1869, they were under the belief that the Irish question could not be solved until the English working class question was solved. But by 1869, they gave up on that. They disagreed with that perspective and argued, no, the struggle will begin in Ireland. And it is the duty of the English working class to support and come to the defense of the Irish question. And I mentioned the Irish question because in a couple of instances, Marx made comparisons to the subjugation of the Irish in England, comparable to the subjugation of blacks in the United States.
In fact, you quote him as saying his attitude toward you. You quote Marx as saying that related to in relation to the Irish worker, he regards himself as a member of the ruling nation, and consequently he becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. He cherishes religious, social, and national prejudices against the Irish worker. His attitude towards him is much the same as that of the poor whites to the Negroes in the former slave states of the USA.
Exactly.
End quote.
Exactly. And that's a part of Marx's intense work during the Civil War and after the Civil War. Marx's intense attention to developments in the United States. They thought that the overthrow of slavery was crucial, and Marx did everything he could from England, from London, trying to advance the struggle and to aid and abet Lincoln's project.
You go on to say, because similar to that same point, and I'm really glad that you dealt with this in your article here. And this is why I just wanted to point out two quick things. One, I see that for some reason I still am experiencing some lag, and I don't understand why. Everybody, I want to let everybody know that I have been endeavoring to correct this issue, and it can't be on my. It just can. I've even boosted the situation in my, I don't even know, like you can't have more Wi-Fi come into this computer. So I don't know, like you literally can't have a faster setup than what I have here. So I don't know, this has to be a StreamYard issue. I can't, again, this can't be. So the other thing, so I'll just point that out. But the other thing that I wanted to address or just raise at least a little bit, even as I see myself lagging here, this is really, so let me invite you to continue on until I can get my situation here, because you write that I thought what you did here in this part was also very important, similar to what we were just talking about. And I think it's important because I think one of the issues that we continue to have that I suffer from here is that reading and studying are two different things. So reading Robinson independent of, as I did, of an actual study in relationship to other texts doesn't necessarily do as much as I think needs to be done. So I think it's important to be reading or coming back to this work in light of what you and others have been writing for a long time, that I and others have missed. So anyway, so one of the points similar to the last one that you address is the national colonial question, similar to what you just said here, what we just did anyway, with the race and class question, the Irish. But you said here, in his critique of Marx and Engels, Robinson's tendency is to argue against straw men of his own making. On no issue is this more apparent than the national question and its relationship to the anti-colonial struggle. In a number of instances, he quotes them to show that they were aware of some problems in the big picture. For example, and then you show how Robinson recognizes that Marx and Engels saw that this was an issue, but then somehow says that they didn't address the colonial and semi-colonial issue. Could you talk a little bit about that particular problem, as I'm at least describing?
Yeah, one example would be in the case of India, for example, or Algeria. Uh, and maybe the Algerian question might be interesting, in Mexico, because in their earlier pronouncements on both Mexico and Algeria, they certainly took what I would call a Eurocentric perspective. And that's true. We can't deny that. At the same time, they corrected both of those positions on both Algeria and also on Mexico, and also in the case of India. And so, yes, it's not enough to point out some of their failings, but what about their corrections and how they were able to learn and to go beyond what they had previously asserted? And so that, I think that's what I'm alluding to in that particular piece. And again, the Irish question, I think, is very telling, because they too thought at a certain moment that the Irish struggle for self-determination would have to wait until the English working class got its act together. I'm working on a little piece, by the way, right now about Marx's daughter, his 15-year-old daughter, Eleanor. Eleanor used to go and visit Engels's wife companion, who was Irish. She was an Irish nationalist. And in 1869, she spent about 3-4 months with Engels and Lydia Burns, the wife. And she came back to the household. Boy, she was a super Irish nationalist. So she convinces her parents, Marx and the wife, Jenny, to go to a protest, a demonstration at Hyde Park in defense of the Irish revolutionaries. And Marx comes back from that. I'm still working on the piece, looking more in details and stuff, but Marx changes his position coming back from that demonstration after looking at the mass movement and so on, this mass demonstration in London. And this is when Marx changes his position. He says in the letter, up until now, I have thought that the Irish struggle would have to wait, should depend upon what the English working class did. I no longer believe that. So that's what I'm trying to get.
Right, I was going to say you quote that in here. For a long time, I believed that it would be possible to overthrow the Irish regime by English working class ascendancy. I have always expressed this point of view in the New York Tribune. Deeper study has now convinced me of the opposite. The English working class will never accomplish anything until it has got rid of Ireland. The lever must be applied in Ireland. That is why the Irish question is so important for the social movement in general.
Right.
Similarly, you go down.
Go ahead. Sorry. I think it's parallel. It's parallel to something that Marx says in 1867 in Capital. When in Capital is a very, very important point that Marx makes about the working class in the United States. And a very famous point he makes, and that is that white workers will never be able to advance as long as black workers are branded, as long as black workers are oppressed. Mm-hmm. White workers will never be able to get their act together, will never be able to liberate themselves. And I think that's the parallel. That's the parallel that he's using to think about what's going on in Ireland vis-a-vis the English working class. So those are the kinds of things. Those are the kinds of things I'm referring to, Jared, when I'm talking about Robinson not recognizing the corrections and the advances that Marx and Engels were making.
Right. The last point I just wanted to raise to that end is similarly discussed by you in what you say is Robinson's missing the point about what Marx and Engels were saying about the revolts of the enslaved. So you write that much of what Robinson employs as evidence to substantiate the reality of a black radical tradition is the long tradition of slave revolts in the diaspora. He charges that Marx and Engels ignored or treated as insignificant such struggles. But evidently, you write, Robinson regards as unimportant the opening lines of the manifesto. quote, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. Slave revolts were as significant for Marx as the result, the end quote, slave revolts were as significant for Marx as the revolt of the workers. This is why he could write in 1860, quote, in my opinion, the biggest things that are happening in the world today are on the one hand, the movement of slaves in America started by the death of John Brown, and on the other, the movement of slaves in Russia, end quote. So for me, when I read that, my argument would be that Marx and Engels misplaced the start of insurrectionism with John Brown, but to the point that obviously John Brown didn't start anything, but other than that, I think to your point, Robinson is missing what Marx and Engels were saying about the revolts of the enslaved, and that they were, at least to a certain extent, incorporating them in their own analysis, and then evolving their analysis, which is, I think, ultimately the most important point of your article, that Marx and Engels were clear that they were not writing, and you quote them as saying they're not writing, this is not a dictate, not a mandate. It's ideas to be applied in their time. But anyway, would you want to add or elaborate on any of that?
No, you're right that slave revolts, black slave revolts, actually didn't begin with John Brown, but what Brown did was very significant.
Sure.
What Brown did was very significant, and Frederick Douglass recognized it. And it was a big issue for Douglass whether or not to take part of it.
Not enough, so I'm sorry to interrupt, but that was always my favorite part about Du Bois's biography of John Brown, that he said that Harriet Tubman disagreed with Douglass and was on her way to help John Brown. And I always wish that little bit of history would have happened. I would love to see. And that's what filmmakers should do, Professor Nimtz. That's the story they should tell. That's the fictitious story they should tell. If Harriet had caught up with John,
exactly,
what would have happened? Anyway, sorry.
Exactly. Douglass, understandably, he didn't think it was going to work. Yeah, he was willing to provide money and any aid he could, and so he just didn't think it was going to work, and that's understandable. Why he would have felt that way. We can't be overly critical of him, but Tubman was ready to join. She was ready to be a part of it, and so I liken it that the beginning of the Cuban Revolution in 1953 begins with an attack, very similar to what Brown was doing. And for many people, it didn't look like Fidel was going to be successful. Some people thought it was crazy what Fidel Castro and others did in 1953 on July 26th. Not unlike what Brown did. And Castro was almost killed, only by the luck of his being Fidel was he able to get out of it. So, but between, I think, between the Nat Turner revolt and what Brown did, I don't think there was a whole lot going on in terms of revolts. So what I think what Brown did was extremely, extremely significant, and it caught Marx's attention. Now, if Marx had known about earlier developments, had done research and so on, I have no doubt he would have embraced it, just like he embraced the famous revolt in ancient Rome, the Spartacus revolt in 77 BC. Things that they knew about and so on, they certainly embraced. I have no doubt. He commented on Toussaint Louverture. Haiti was a big deal when it came to developments within Europe. So yeah, I have no reason to doubt that had he known or had there been uprisings and so on, like the Brown uprising, that he would have embraced it.
Well, Professor Nimtz, we're already coming up on the hour, and I want to just make sure that you have a few minutes to lay out anything I didn't invite you to in my questions, and then there are a couple questions in the chat that maybe we could get to real quick. But initially, I just wanted to well, for instance, did Marx talk about the 1865 Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica? Are you aware of this?
Yes, he did. He commented on it later during the period of Reconstruction. During Reconstruction, when he was trying to figure out whether or not what would happen after the overthrow of slavery in the United States, and the model, and he thought perhaps that what happened in Jamaica might be a model for what would take place within the United States. Yeah, the Morant Bay was a big deal because everybody in England knew about it, and people like John Stuart Mill and others and so on. So yeah, Marx certainly knew about it. And
what about the Haitian Revolution? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, he looked at the Haitian Revolution, and he didn't write a whole lot about it. It's true. And he made sort of a marginal cursory comments about it, especially not so much about the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution and all of the difficulties that were taking place in Haiti in the aftermath of the revolution, all of the contradictions that you and I know very, very much about that continue in many ways within Haiti. They were certainly aware of it. They were certainly conscious of it. My general impression is that they felt that developments in France would have to take precedent, would have to come forward, because the Haitian Revolution was isolated. And that was a problem that they recognized very early about the revolutionary process. A revolution that takes place that's isolated from developments elsewhere in the world has less chance of succeeding. It's when revolutions coincide with uprisings elsewhere in the world. And unfortunately, the Haitian Revolution was isolated for so long, which the consequences of which all of us, we live with today.
So and maybe this is a good way for us to end. We sort of started and have been talking about your thoughts on Robinson's concept of the Black radical tradition.
Yeah.
But what do you make? What would be your sort of grand summary of Robinson's concept of Black radical tradition?
Yeah, I think it's too sterile and academic, in that it's not related to what's actually happening in the real world of politics, the real struggles that are actually taking place, especially the Cuban Revolution. And maybe I'd like to take advantage of your question about the Cuban Revolution and slavery and so on, because as you know,
well, this one here. Are you talking about this? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you might have seen this one here because someone's asking about the relative condition of Cubans of African descent.
Right. Yeah, I make an argument that the George Floyd phenomenon does not exist in Cuba. And I think that's an important fact. And what I mean by the George Floyd phenomenon is the record of police murdering Black people. And that is, when you encounter a police in the United States, the probability that you will not come out of that encounter alive is much greater than what is the case in Cuba since 1959. Before 1959, yes. Before 1959, just like Brazil. Think about Brazil. Think about what happened last week in Brazil, in one of the favelas in Brazil. And 25 people were murdered that was Cuba. All of that ended after 1959. How do we explain that? My argument is that the Cubans made a revolution. And I say that because, again, Cuba had slavery, as some people argue. Some people argue that the reason for the George Floyd phenomenon in the United States is the original sin, chattel slavery. Well, if that's true, how do we explain why Cuba, which had chattel slavery longer than the United States, it began earlier in Cuba, racial slavery, and it lasted 2 decades longer within Cuba? So if that's true, if the slavery, the original sin question, is the explanation, how do we explain why the George Floyd phenomenon does not exist in Cuba, but it exists in Brazil? And my argument
Professor Nimtz,
yeah,
as Ellis Child keeps pointing out, but Cubans of African descent remain at the bottom of the society. So you're saying,
yeah, but and I'm saying there are problems within Cuba, but the probability of an encounter with the police as a person of African descent in Cuba is not the same outcome as it is in the United States. I think that's a big deal. In the same also with regard to COVID-19. Black Cubans are less likely to die from COVID-19. And I'm from New Orleans, by the way, and I wrote an article years ago about Hurricane Katrina. Black people in Cuba are less likely to die from hurricanes as my folks in New Orleans did. And I'm saying it's because the Cubans made a revolution. So yes, there are challenges. There are challenges that Black people face within Cuba.
And just lastly for Ella's child, nobody disagrees, including Marx. Marx himself said Marxism is not enough. So nobody, he himself said that his own, that what was being done under the guise of Marxism was insufficient and inaccurate as even an assessment of his own work. So nobody is arguing that Marx is all we need.
Right. Exactly.
That's not the argument here. The argument is just simply that the criticism of Marx is in some cases misplaced. And by the way, I'm seeing again how much I'm lagging. Look at everybody. I don't know if you can see this. This is the strength of my signal. Look how low the ping rate is. Look at how low the ping rate is. It's so low. It is so low. The signal in here is so strong, and I even enhanced it since my last broadcast. So I don't know what is going on. This is clearly not on my end. I refuse. So anyway, Professor Nimtz, unfortunately, this issue is me today at least. So we'll have to do this again because we have to hear more about your time in Tanzania with Walter Rodney. We have to hear more about your other work and get caught up and just have you back to just continue the conversation. So I really appreciate you. Again, I want to just say again, just one more time, I want to appreciate you for reaching out and encourage others to do. I don't think any of us here at BPM have the staffing, the chase producers to go find and catch everybody that we need to talk to. So sometimes we do need folks to reach out to us, and we welcome it. And especially when we've been missing out on some important work such as this here. So again, I want to thank you, Professor Nimtz, for doing that, and encourage that others follow your example.
Okay. Man.
So anyway, thanks again, my man, and we'll be in touch. I really appreciate what you've done here. Thanks again.
Okay, thanks.
All right, peace. Okay, all right, everybody. So look, I'm gonna step out here for a minute. I want to thank again Professor Nimtz for coming through, and I'll follow up with him afterwards about getting a copy of the article out. What he feels is best about that. And I'll certainly share the full citation in the show notes to this show. And then we'll encourage everybody to please come back at 10 a.m. for the premiere come back to Black Power Media for the 10 a.m. premiere of the classic conversation that Kalanji Changa had with Max Stanford about his time with the Revolutionary Action Movement. I can't wait to see it because I know that Brother Stanford is a legend and has some important. And by the way, his example was one that I pointed to in the way that if you look at the way he was mischaracterized in A Lie of Reinvention, his example is one I point to in A Life of Reinvention that I point to in A Lie of Reinvention, our critique of that work. That was an obvious misappropriation of what was actually going on. So Stanford's experience with Malcolm X, I'm saying, was intentionally recrafted in the book attributed to Manning Marable to disparage Malcolm and his increasing radicalism. And but anyway, so I look forward to that. That's at 10 a.m. And then I'll be back at 12 noon with Bob Brown of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, Guinea Conakry, to talk about some of their work and his own time in and around Chicago with the Black Panther Party and Fred Hampton and more. So come back for that as well. So again, thanks to everybody for coming through in the chat, and to those who will see this later, we appreciate you. Please do like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you and become a member if at all possible, to support the increasing work that we're going to be doing and are doing. And we'll be back later. And, you know, as my man Pierre at Comedy Hype says, if there's something that we didn't get to, make sure.
Put it in the comments.
And we'll catch you next time here at I Mix What I Like Live, which is in just a couple of hours. And as always, as Fred Hampton used to say to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody. Catch you next time. Thanks again.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.